Another blood-red sunset and yet another moon face, and still another 100 miles to my next resting place. Driving down the road, eyes on the horizon. Within my car, I'm all alone, but feeling good and feeling strong, knowing that this path I'm on brings me to myself. I'm driving.
Hey now all, this is the Spirit Doctor, Kelly Sparta, and you are listening to Spirit Sherpa, the show that helps and encourages you on your journey to unlock your magic mojo. Today, I am joined by Kelly Leonard, who is the Executive Director of Learning and Applied Improvisation at Second City Works. His book, Yes and, was published to critical acclaim by HarperCollins. Kelly has spoken at Aspen Ideas Festival, Microsoft, Twitter, TEDx Broadway, and has guest lectured at Stanford's Graduate School of Business and the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. He hosts the podcast Getting to Yes and for WGN Radio. For over 20 years, he oversaw Second City's live theatrical divisions, working with such talent as Tina Fey, Stephen Colbert, Amy Poehler, Seth Meyers, Keegan-Michael Key, and others. He and his wife, Ann Libera, were awarded the Creative Voice Award in 2019 by Arts Alliance Illinois. Kelly, I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I know it's a little outside of your wheelhouse.
I'm actually terribly curious. Thank you for having me.
So I heard you on this other podcast, and you were talking about this topic of sway. And I just loved it so much that I reached out immediately and was like, I know this isn't usually your thing, but oh my God, you have to come and talk to my people about this because they so need to hear it. So, can you just introduce the topic of sway and what it means and this concept that you've come up with?
It's not my concept. I adopted it and brought it into the sort of improv lexicon because I think it fits. But I was talking to Shelley Archambault, who is one of the first African-American female tech entrepreneurs, and she had a book coming out, and she doesn't believe in work-life balance. She talked about work-life sway. And I'm like immediately, and then I listened to the podcast Sway, that's Kara Swisher, and because what we're doing at any given time, some of our body is going to be here, some of our body is going to be there. We can't, I think because human beings are desperately trying to find the linear patterns that make sense of the world we live in, they're incredibly uncomfortable with these great gradations. And improv actually teaches you to be comfortable with discomfort. And so work-life sway is really both an acknowledgement that you're never going to be in all in one place at one time, and gives you, I think, permission to play in all the spaces. We talk in improvisation about being fiercely in the moment, which is an excellent, excellent way to live. But the reality, too, is that sometimes you're going to get pulled out of that. And if you see that as a betrayal of something that you live by, that's a mistake, too. So really, I think it's an acknowledgement and a permission.
That's fantastic. You gave me so much to unpack. Thank you. Because so something I think I may have mentioned this in my email begging you to come on the show, was that Kathy, who is one of the regular people who's on the call with me, she went to Second City Improv. And she and I together run transformational retreats. And we have talked in depth about the concept of how yes and getting comfortable in discomfort, those are key spiritual evolution issues, right? These are things that we deal with all the time, especially in a virtual environment where we may have planned a structure, but whatever the participant brings to the table is what they bring to the table, and we have to be prepared to respond in whatever way is necessary in the moment. And so, she and I ended up having a very deep conversation about improv when I told her you were coming on the show, because I've always thought that I wasn't very good at improv because I was never funny.
that's not necessary.
Well, and that's what she said. She said, improv isn't about being funny, but I improv all the time. She's like, oh, you're fantastic at it. And I'm like, but I'm not, but I am situationally funny, but I'm just, I was never good at it on stage.
It's interesting. I just want to jump in with this because one of my very early interviews for the podcast was with the Dr. Reverend Samuel Wells, who's the vicar of St. Martin in London. And he took an improv class when he was at Duke Divinity School and then ended up teaching there. And he talks all about the sort of reintegration that happens with improvisation and saw it through a spiritual lens that I had actually never thought about. And of course, have now studied for the last really 5-6 years. That's been what I've been focusing on, is sort of academic links and spiritual links and all that stuff. And the thing about yes and is you're never going to hear a very gifted improviser use those words. It really is about a mindset of entering the conversation of like, hey, I'm going to enter curious. I'm going to enter with assuming good intent, assuming that this person has something to offer me, trying to build off what they make so that both of our fingerprints are on it. And you do that until someone shows you that they're not a good faith actor. And then you move on. I mean, because that can happen. We don't need to be Pollyannic about this. But it is a great starting point for anything in terms of the human endeavor.
That's so funny because I feel like you just described my life.
Well, there you go. So you've been improvising this whole time. You just didn't know.
Clearly. So, when we talk about sway, right? Because one of the things that I'm talking about on the podcast this year is I'm talking about becoming a light worker and stepping into your spiritual work, things like that. And so I'm trying to talk a little bit more about business these days sometimes. And so as a business owner myself, I find myself in a lot of sway. Like I just got back from Costa Rica yesterday, and I was on a retreat, which, for me was supposed to be this sort of vacation while researching thing, right? And I found myself talking about my business all the time, right? Because everybody there was going, oh, you're a transformational shaman? Here, talk to me about this. And so it became this sort of, I'm on vacation, I'm not on vacation, I'm on vacation, I'm not on vacation, right? And so, what I leaned into, and I want to get your sense on this. What I leaned into was this, I will talk about it so long as it feels easy because I'm on vacation, right?
I think, the last couple of years, for a variety of reasons, we've had to explore our boundaries. And me as a middle-aged, straight, white man of tremendous privilege, need to understand that when I walk into a room, my boundaries are immediately different than someone else's. The balance is not necessarily there. And so for all of us, it means something different. So for me, it might mean, hey, be quiet for a while. Let everyone else talk. It might mean lean forward. It might be prompting other people in the room to share something that they might not share. And that's important. And for someone else, it might be, I got to protect my time. That I've been giving too much of my time. And so I think when you talk about sway and then you look at it through this improv lens, it's really about how do I become more agile and resilient? And I think the problem in the past is people either assumed you were a resilient and agile person or you weren't, when in fact you can practice the skills of agility and resilience. Can I share an exercise that does this?
Please. This is something that I talk to my students about all the time. So I'd love to have something new. Yeah.
So this is an exercise that we've used a lot in the virtual spaces because it works perfectly. It's an exercise called Point and Untel. And it's very simple. We flash up an image of something. It could be an object, it could be a person. And everyone has to shout out what that object isn't. That's the rule. Very simple. You just have to shout what that object isn't. So if an apple comes up, you say wheelbarrow or whatever. And we do this with like 15 images. And it's hard. And it's hard for people because they're not naturally divergent thinkers. And divergent thinking is key as an underpinning to agility and then resiliency as well. So this is, and then when you practice it over and over again, you get better at it. You're like, oh, okay, I'm teaching my mind. And this is, if you want to tie it to the science, it's really about what Danny Kahneman talks about when he talks about system 1 and system 2 thinking, that we've got a fast brain and a slow brain. And improv is about going in between those all the time, in between those. And so people marvel at the wit of these improvisers, and like, it feels like magic. And it's like, it's not magic, it's practice. They have just practiced this over and over again. So they can be sort of empty and full, and go back and forth in that. And these are just, evolutionarily speaking, what our mind is telling us is we're still running from tigers, right? So we're sensing danger, and people look different than us. And so we have to find ways to retrain our bodies and our minds for the modern world. And this is going to haunt us for decades. I mean, from what I understand with the science, it's like we're maybe a couple hundred years away from catching up with how we started in this world.
Yeah. So can you say a little bit more about that fast mind and slow mind? Because I can hear my listeners going, what's that?
Yeah. So Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner, and Tversky was his partner, passed away, also won the Nobel Prize. They came up with this idea, and really they're sort of the fathers of modern behavioral science, that our brains have what they've termed system 1, system 2. So 1 is the fast brain, which is like we just look at someone, we sense we know they're a boy, or we know that they're a male man or whatever, and we don't have to think about it. It's just automatic. But then we have the other part of the brain, which is slower and more deliberate. Some people call it the jury. My friend Zoe Chance at Yale has just written a book about this, and that's one of the terms she has used. And that brain takes its time to kind of figure out, well, what's really going on here? And we're always operating with both. Both are flawed. Especially because we mostly use system 1. I think it's something like 90% of the time. But the reality is, like, and you've caught yourself, and this is actually, laughter emanates from this, is like, I certainly caught myself being like, that woman is hot on the bike, and it turns out it's a guy, and as a heterosexual male, I'm like, oh, all right, surprised. And it's funny because it's a surprise, and humor itself contains a lot of those elements. That happens way more than we know because the person doesn't turn around. And I'm just using that metaphorically. And then the jury part of the brain, system 2, that is flawed too. And they've got studies on this, which is like with judges, that their sentencing is much harsher right before lunch, that their sentencing is harsher when their college football team lost. And this might sound nuts, but it's not. It's like the weather affects, this, the weather affects your mood. Like when it's like, I mean, I'm in Chicago. I live in Chicago. It's like these months in January and February, it's just like brutal. And so I try to find as many ways to shine light. So I've got a salt lamp here and another kind of thing there. And, so all of this, when we understand it, is why we have various biases in many ways, and why we also have what Kahneman, his latest book, calls noise, which is misunderstandings, miscalculations having nothing to do with bias, but having to do with a lot of noise. So when you understand these things, the way to kind of work on them is these kind of improv exercises that I talk about, which is building up muscles of better listening, better curiosity, divergent thinking. One of my favorite things, like when lockdown happened, one of the very first, a friend of mine who used to be at Yale Exec Ed was now at a major soft drink company. And she's like, can you deliver a virtual workshop around resiliency? We're in trouble. And I went to my wife, I'm like, who's a longtime educator and director at Second City. I'm like, do you have anything? And she's like, I actually do. I just created this exercise called Wish. And we used it with them. And we said, okay, take a piece of paper and write down 3 columns. First column, write down something you wish you could do right now that you can't. So I wrote like swimming in the salt water. In the second column, write down the emotion you think you'd feel. I wrote down refreshed. And then in the final column, write down something you can do to experience that emotion right now. And I'm like, splash water on my face, go for a walk, work out. And the idea is like, we may not have any control over the events at hand. The thing we do have agency over and control is our attitude towards those things. and they need, and it, they the only way that works really is practice. And that's the missing link probably in all of this stuff. When Viktor Frankl talked about this in Man's Search for Meaning, right? Who went through the Holocaust, an incredible book, really important. That's something I still go back to. But just saying it is not enough. You need to practice it.
Yeah. Well, and this is one of those things that I've been talking about for the last 2 years on this podcast, is this idea that we are in this collective trauma of the pandemic where, we're constantly being traumatized by some new thing. And yet at the same time, we're gaslighting ourselves that we're not being traumatized because we're looking at our surroundings and going, well, I'm just sitting in my house. How traumatizing can that be? Right. And it's the people that I'm talking to, my listeners are already coming from those environments most of the time, right? Where we've had trauma and we may have been gaslit already. And so you're just cascading one thing on top of another. And so, it's been about how do you take volition back, right? How do you claim your life when your life is being externally limited, right?
A little over 2 years ago, we lost our 17-year-old daughter, Nora, to cancer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. And having gone through, she got diagnosed, it was about a year, and passed away just after her birthday, about a week after. And one of the things that, and Ann and I had created prior to this, a whole program around improvisation for caregiving. That we worked on with the Cleveland Clinic and others. So we came into this with this sort of skill set that we used, but then we hadn't done anything around grief and trauma. Thank God my friend Rachel sent me Bessel van der Kolk's book around trauma living in the body. And he has a whole section on improv at the end. And I was just like, and between therapy and working out and reading and then most importantly, so when Nora was sick, we started a Caring Bridge page where we would do updates. We did that all the way along, and we got tremendous support. Of course, Ann and I have worked at Second City, both of us over 30 years, and worked a lot of famous people who were always sending videos and support. It was great. But then afterwards, I decided to keep writing. And at first I wrote every single day, and I held nothing back. And the amount of people who kept showing up for me and then would show and say, look, I don't want to compare trauma points. I'm like, tell me, we're all walking around with a lot. It's like, and we don't talk about it, and we do that at our peril. And this idea around, what I discovered, in the grief journey, which the biggest enemy would be isolation. And the problem so I didn't have this problem because Second City, I could walk into anyone's office and just start crying and they'd be there for me. For a comedy theater, we are very dramatic. But that was great. But most workplaces aren't like that. And we need to change that conversation, because these things are really hard. So to your point about like when the pandemic started and all this other stuff, people would reach out and be like, how are you doing? And I'm like, I've already been through the worst. I've been through the worst. I am still here. I'm broken, but I'm still here. It shouldn't take a tragedy, especially something like losing a child. But for those of us that have been through that particular or things like that, to not draw some sense of meaning and purpose is to I think, misunderstand the larger forces at work, because human beings die. We're going to die. Our parents die. It's something that happens, and it's not fair, and it sucks, but it happens. So I think, just generally speaking, allowing your pain and your suffering to be there, but not be everything.
It's about not investing in the pain, right? We can have it, but I call it the misery box, right? It's like, well, you can have your misery box, or you can live in your misery box. But I don't recommend
the misery box is there. You can't get rid of it.
Right. It's there, but you don't have to live in it. You don't have to invest in it, right?
My therapist and I stumbled upon that concept in a session where we were talking about like, okay, you have the okay, you have the not okay, you have the happy. I mean, I've had happy moments at concerts and comedy shows and with friends, and all those rooms are there. And this is, it's so funny. And cause I do a lot of, obviously I do a lot of work in business. And I was talking to Dan Pink recently about how often like Buddha comes up, or Buddhism in these conversations. He's like, yeah, Buddha and Peter Drucker come up all the time. I'm like, yeah, okay, a Viennese psychologist and Buddha. But I think for valid reasons, which is the Buddhists always looked at suffering as something that is about the human condition and the duality, the idea that these multiple things are all happening at the same time. I think it's hard for most humans. I think it's particularly hard for Americans.
Yes, Americans, we have it. I mean, we're taught that we have to be productive. We have to be moving forward. You know, there's no room for anything. In fact,
no crying in baseball.
Oh, there's no crying in baseball. Yeah. And there was this series of retreats that I went to, these workshops that I went to, that shall remain nameless to protect the guilty. But the upshot was that they did this process that was very shamanic in nature. But they would go drive, breakthrough, drive, breakthrough, drive. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm exhausted. I just want to fall down. And it's like, where's the integration? This is all the masculine side. Where's the feminine side? Where's the flow? Where's the integration? Where's the downtime and the stillness? Where is that? And it's like, no, this is the American version of spirituality. I'm like, but it's going to make you fall down, go boom.
And it's also not tied to the science. I mean, the like you mentioned, flow. My wife and I were lucky enough to speak at a event where the flow guy, I'm not going to try to pronounce his name, was on before us. Mihai, I can't say this like that. But his work is amazing, and Adam Grant talks about this too, the Wharton professor, which is like, you need boredom, you need time of play, you need stillness, all these variety of and here's the ironic thing about all this, which is all these business people, especially the men, they love sports, they understand this completely in sports, the need to rest and then work and the repetition and the practice and all that. And that's all about peak performance. And if they go back to their offices and they think they should yell people into doing good, it's like, no, this, like in music and any crafts, like anyone who is like really good at their work in these other domains, is usually working by the scientific method, except for where everyone's making money in America. In the business context.
Yeah. Well, and they've done studies on that too. I mean, they've done experiments in Europe on, let's shorten the workday, right? And people get more productive. Go figure.
Well, yeah, and Microsoft in Asia did that with the 4-day work week, and overwhelmingly it was more productive, and they just went right back to the 5-day. So it's not just us. It's and this is the thing. I'm 55. I feel like the last 5 years or so, just the blinders have been ripped off, where I'm like, oh, we structure our schools terribly. Like that's not based on the science. Our healthcare system is terrible. And the sort of systemic racism that I certainly was party to, is abhorrent. And the penal system, the way we throw more people in prison in this country. So go down this list and you've got to realize, like, we're doing it wrong. And I get that not one of us can change it, but all of us can. And in improv, we say, all of us are better than one of us. And the whole idea is about these ensembles. This was the idea I was kicking around for a while with some folks, and I got to re-pick it up, which is, you're not going to solve anything one person at a time, and you're not going to move entire tribes. But I bet we could move teams. I bet we could go to work teams of 10, 12 people and train them up and have them shift into this more productive, better mindset. And if we just keep going block by block, team by team, maybe that's the way we do it.
It's interesting because one of the things the pandemic has done for me is that I've binged a lot of old television shows. And so I've been watching a lot of the shows from the 90s again. And I'm realizing how much we have moved in that 30 years. I mean, just stunning amounts. So much more than the previous 30 years, right?
Yeah, my comedy professor wife has to do a lot of trigger warnings before episodes. Like she's like, when she does so old TV, like The Honeymooners, like he's not going to hit her. So let's start there with that. But then, yeah, I mean, even my friend Tina Fey in 30 Rock, there's episodes she's asked to pull because they just weren't. And we got to also let ourselves off the hook. Seeing our 1990 or 95 selves with our 2022 eyes is not fair to anyone. And people should be allowed to evolve.
And I'm just taking it as a sign that it is changing, that it is moving, right? I mean, it's moving at Mach speed compared to previous shifts, right? And so I take that as very encouraging. It also, is a statement of how much culture is breaking down right now, because culture can't change this quickly unless it is falling apart, because that's the nature of culture, right? So
I was listening to an Ezra Klein podcast with Noam Chomsky, and Chomsky, for as woke as he is, using that term, does not believe in this sort of immediate social change. He doesn't believe that it can happen. He sort of cited the gay marriage thing of like, it just took time and then it changed. But if you had tried to force it, and people did, it was never going to work. I don't know if I agree. It's not my area of expertise. I certainly believe that things need to change, but I also live in a world where I see how it operates. And, like trying to fix the militarized police state is a problem. Trying to fix the penal system is a problem. We got the problem with the schools. We got problems with healthcare. I mean, just keep adding to that list. We haven't even mentioned climate change.
Yeah.
Right?
There's so much. And being that my life has been spent studying change and how people change, I have to admit that I'm on Noam's side, because it doesn't happen quickly, and people don't change if they don't want to, right? And so the challenge then becomes, how do you set up systems? Because people will change when forced, but they're going to be cranky about it, and they're going to resist it, and they're going to do, but they will eventually do it, like desegregation, right? It didn't change any mindsets, but it did change the culture, and slowly, very slowly, very slowly, very slowly, the culture has shifted. But because it was forced, I think it took longer, right? I think it's more propaganda that needs to be done. And I use that term in a positive way, not a negative way, because we've got so much propaganda that nobody even knows what's true anymore, which is part of the problem now.
I think also because of social media, and because we've become more national and global in terms of our scope and what we're looking at, we forget that the work we need to do is probably on our block. So it's all the school board stuff, which is like, if you want to look what's happening. I mean, this is why book burnings are happening, get on the school board. Because I think more people, I've found more human beings are generally reasonable than the opposite.
Yes, I would agree with that. The thing that's happening right now, though, is that so many people are traumatized, and they're so empty, and they're so burned out that their ability to be reasonable has been exhausted. And I think that's what's happening because of the pandemic, because of all of this stuff that's going on. And that's been the big problem. I sat on the airplane yesterday and had a conversation with the guy next to me, and he was talking about how he was frustrated with the medical establishment and how they don't look up alternative stuff, and they don't look into stuff that happens overseas and whatever. And the woman in front of us got up at one point in the conversation, turned around and said, "My husband is a doctor, and you are just saying terrible things about doctors, and he works very hard." And she just like read us the riot act. And we weren't talking about her husband. We were just talking about the state of the medical industry and about our personal experiences with medical professionals that we had experienced. And I pointed that out to her. I said, we don't know your husband. We're not talking about your husband. And this isn't part of it. But she was just, I could see that she was so empty and she was so overdone and she just had nothing left. And anything that could potentially trigger her had just triggered her, and she turned into a Karen. And I'm like, I could see the being inside, and I'm like, you don't want to be a Karen, but you're being a Karen, right?
Right. Well, this is the so one of the exercises that we created with the Second Science Project, which is a project that my wife and I co-led at the University of Chicago, working with behavioral scientists. We had done the yes and exercise for them. It's one of the exercises we bring into tons of businesses, and they're like, we totally get that. There's actually existing research to support that. But what happens when you have a disagreement with someone that you fundamentally, disagree, but you need to stay inside the conversation? What do you do then? And we didn't know, and they didn't know, and so we went back to our respective laboratories. And when we came together, we actually discovered, and there's a paper coming out next year about this. And what we discovered is that the term we use is thank you because. So if you need to stay inside this conversation and you don't agree, and the example I use on this is a real one, which was Nora, when she got sick, one of her dear friends, their parents are anti-vax. So this is well before, we were having this conversation nationally and internationally. We wanted the girls to be able to have a relationship, but we couldn't allow them to be in the same room together. And so in talking to the parents, I used this and I said, thank you. And what that does first is set off the gratitude part of the brain. So immediately they're not going to be on the defensive. Then the because is crucial. I needed to find something I agreed with, and usually it's values. And so what I said is, thank you, because you care so much for your daughter's health. You don't want her getting sick from these vaccines. I care so much for my daughter's health. I don't want her to get sick from not having vaccines. We want the same thing. We're like totally aligned on the same thing. We just have different ways of getting there. And that provided a way for us to work through this thing. And I bring this up on many shows that I'm on. And everyone sort of points to like, well, wow. Yeah. I mean, the world we live in right now, no one is willing to do that work. And what I would suggest is you don't need to be giving up on the systemic changes that you think are right. You don't need to be giving up on your values to try to see another person as human, and to try to see the other person as potentially having some valid concerns, whatever they are. I'm a liberal. I'm not pro-life, but the argument could be made that I'm a baby killer. Right? I mean, that's like, I can actually understand the logic of that argument. When I look at it, I'm like, oh, I get that. Well, that's what it's right. That like, so, just trying to both show someone you understand where they're coming from, but also be able to interrogate your own positions and see how they might be perceived as problematic. This is the work that I think we need to do for this human endeavor to flourish, which is what I think we all want. Here's what I know. If we don't do that work, the other side is we're done, because we don't do this alone.
And one of the things that I have found, because I've had these conversations too, where I'm talking to somebody who has completely diametrically opposed, opinions, and it's somebody I respect and I love, and I'm like, and periodically we sit down and we talk politics, because I'm like, all right, I need to understand how you believe the way you believe, because you seem to me to be a reasonable person, and this seems to me to be an unreasonable approach. And so clearly there's some reason on your side that I'm missing. And so please educate me so that I can understand where your reasoning is from, because you are a reasonable person. And so we have this conversation and we each say the same thing to the other. And then, we each get to the point where we will talk for long enough where, my marker for me is when I feel like I need to convince her of something, then I stop the conversation, because I have stopped being curious and I have gone into manipulation. Right. And so, yeah. And so it's about, okay, if I'm trying to convince you I'm right, then I'm no longer relating. So I need to stop and I back up. and I need to go back into my curiosity, right? Because that doesn't work.
There's been studies about this, which is, to truly get someone to shift, takes a lot of work, but normally it's about asking question after question for them to justify their position until they're backed into a corner where they themselves realize that they can't actually rationalize the root of that. But it takes step after step after step for someone to get there. So it's like, tell me more about this, because this is what I'm hearing, and here's what I'm not seeing. But talk to me more about this. I'm really curious about what and people, like, human beings want to be seen. So that doesn't need to be an unpleasant activity.
Well, and it's not really designed to necessarily change her mind, because she's entitled to her opinion, right? I'm just trying to understand. I'm like, what are you hearing that I'm not hearing? What are you seeing that I'm not seeing? Maybe you can change my mind. It could happen, but it's when there's so much angst and acrimony in the entire process right now that it's hard not to get that tapped into it when you're having the conversation, because it's just endemic in the world, right?
The academic Jonathan Haidt has a bunch of, this is his work, and he really roots it down to these mindsets where, one side is really just so concerned with security, and another side is so concerned with fairness. And if that is your root place, you're going to have really vicious disagreements over things, because those two things do not go together.
And Kathy and I have had a long conversation on fairness, because we both came up out of the fairness concept, and we spent our entire lives with our parents going, life isn't fair. It was like beat into us. And we were like, but it should be fair.
Yeah. Well, and generationally speaking, the young people I work with, are steadfast in that, well, no. And this is this thing that we're calling the Great Resignation, which is in fact actually a meaning crisis, I think, is part of what they're wrestling with, because and it's valid. It's completely valid for all the things we've talked about today.
Yeah. And there's this desire for people to find their purpose. And I always talk about that. I'm like, people keep going looking for their purpose. And I'm like, look, your purpose isn't outside of you. Your purpose is the fullest expression of your authentic self. And so if you could just strip away all of the crap, then you are on purpose.
Yeah, and this is about, I think a lot of ways you can find your purpose is when you are crafting your story. So my wife runs the first ever BA in comedy writing and performance at Columbia College. So she's a comedy professor. And she often talks about the difference between improv and stand-up is in improv, we're perspective taking. We're asking the audience for what's on their mind, and then we're playing with that and reflecting it back to them. One of the key things that stand-up comics do is they do perspective giving. In the first 5 minutes, they have to teach the audience about who they are. And often that story starts with some negative flaw of theirs. So think about your favorite comedian, like Patton Oswalt's mine, and is like, oh, his whole career started with that. He's this flubby, chubby, guy. Amy Schumer,
Robin Williams.
Yeah. All of them. It's that thing. So, and they craft the story about themselves, but I think great CEOs do this as well, which is part of what I'm going to share a difficulty in my journey. Because then you're going to see that I'm here as a leader because I got through it, and I can lead you through your difficult journey. And so as we're actually developing a class at Northwestern at the Farley School of Entrepreneurship with Sunil Gupta based on his book Backable. And he has these rich stories that he sort of discovered when he at first was not backable. He wasn't raising funds and not doing well. And then he decided to no, I'm going to tell stories about my mom who had this really difficult journey, but actually came out on top. And I'm going to talk about my failures. And then I'm going to shift that story to show you what my vision is. And so I think we don't need to look at purpose as magical. I think we need to look at purpose as the definitions of our lives that have been meaningful and can be meaningful to others. Something like that.
That's fantastic. I love that. And I think we'll use that as our final point for the conversation. I'll tell you a little secret, which is that I so loved the way your mind worked when I listened to you on that podcast that I was like, I just have to talk to him. So thank you for letting me be part of this conversation. It has been a wild ride through a lot of different topics, but my students, my listeners rather, tell me all the time, they're like, oh, sometimes I have to listen to your episodes 2 and 3 times because there's so much content. And I'm going to be like, yeah, you guys going to have to listen to this one like 4 or 5 times to get all the references, because that's what they're going to do. They're going to go and look up all the books and they're going to read all the things. So you've just given them a wealth of stuff to learn. And I will do the same thing. And so thank you for the gift. I appreciate you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah. And so your book again is
Yes and Lessons from the Second City, and that's available HarperCollins. It's still in hardcover. And then the Getting the Yes and podcast, which you can either find at WGN Radio in Chicago or on the Second City Works website at secondcity.com. And then you can follow me on social. I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn, and I post all stuff there and studies and others kind of weird stuff that I come across because I've got this really cool job that lets me do that.
That's awesome. So I encourage you guys to go and follow him. Kelly's amazing. If he hasn't proven that to you by now, then you haven't been listening to. So, all right. Thank you so much for being with us, Kelly. I so appreciate you. And that's all we have for this week. Tune in next time when I share another episode on energy, magic, and the spirit world. I'm Kelly Sparta here with Kelly Leonard, and you have been listening to Spirit Sherpa. So long, everyone.
Driving down the road, eyes on the horizon. Within my car, I'm all alone, but feeling good and feeling strong, knowing that this path I'm on brings me to myself. I'm driving, wondering where my spirit will. I'm driving.